here into the control room. And notice, by the way, it sounds different in the control room than it does in any of the other environments, right?
It is so cool.
So just real quick, just do a little clapping here too, right? This is a different sounding environment. It's different from there, it's different from there, and it's different from other parts of the building. All of these spaces are designed with specific sonic goals in mind, right? A control room is designed to essentially, as much as possible, take the room sound out of the equation, because in the control room, this is where you're monitoring, this is where you're judging the accuracy or pleasingness of the recording that you're making, right? So you don't want the sound of the control room contributing to the way you think you're hearing things. So as much as possible, you try to have the most direct sound in the control room, the least amount of coloration from the control room walls, things like that. I forgot to mention, I mentioned it to the other group, one of the reasons we're wary of those reflections from walls is the way your ears interact with your brain. So if you hear two sounds that are within, depending on the person, it's an average, but average people, if it's within like less than 50 milliseconds or so, the distance between those sounds, the time between those sounds, your brain just mashes them together into one sound. Your brain thinks that they're one sound, even though it was two discrete reflections. And that's what reverb is. Actually, it's you guys have heard of reverb before, and you've probably heard reverb, right? Reverb, what we think about now, tends to be artificial reverberation, simulating what happens in a natural environment like a cave or a canyon or something like that, or a big room. But the reverb that you hear in the natural world is all of the millions and millions of individual little echoes of my voice bouncing off of this, bouncing off of that, bouncing off of that, bouncing off of that, bouncing off the walls, bouncing off of all of you people, right? Bouncing off of everything and coming back to my ears later than the original sound. But those individual reflections tend to be less than 50 milliseconds apart, so my brain kind of mushes them together into one sound, and that's what that long whooshy sound of reverb is. It's individual reflections being combined together by your brain, right? So that's a large part of why we design studios the way we do, is not necessarily to eliminate the reverb, because you have never actually heard a sound in your life in the real world that didn't have reverb on it. Without it, it would sound pretty weird, right? But to control the sound of the reverb, because if the reverb mashes with the original sound in your brain, it's going to affect the way your brain hears the original sound. It's going to affect the tonality of it, right? So we design these spaces to have the best sounding combination of direct sound and reflected sound. We capture the best combination with microphones that are supremely designed to capture that type of sound. They come into the recording console. So these are a lot of buttons on this console, a lot of knobs, right? But if you actually look at them, it's broken up into what we call channel strips, and each one of these channel strips has the same set of buttons as everything else. So even though there's 1,000-something buttons and knobs on this console, you don't have to learn them each one individually. If you learn one of this, then you learn how to use the whole thing, right? And each one of those microphones gets plugged into a panel in the wall. The signal from that microphone, each one gets its own individual channel strip. And on the channel strip for that microphone, I can apply gain, I can EQ it, I can compress it, I can do all these sorts of signal processing tasks to try to make it sound even better, right? And then each one of these individual channel strips goes to its own track on a recording device. Something like back there, the multi-track tape machine. Doesn't get used as much these days, although we do still use it occasionally. We love it. Imparts its own beautiful sound on things. But more often than not, most people these days are recording to a computer, right?
Yeah.
Now, the computer, it's not just a matter of plugging into the microphone input on the computer like with a little 1/4-inch cable. There's special boxes designed to get, in this case, 60 different individual inputs into the computer, right? And each one of those is recorded onto its own lane in the recording device. And that's one event. That's the recording, right? When you go listen to music, right? You don't come into a studio and someone sits there and mixes it live, right? You listen to it probably on earbuds or in your car or something many ears you got? Two. Most people have two, right? I've met people that only had one, but most people have 2 ears, right? And so that's a separate process. The recording is capturing the output of each one of these microphones as best as we can, and that's the recording. The mix is where we then take all of those individual sounds that were captured from the microphones and combine them together into a 2-track format. It was multi-track, one for each microphone. Now it's 2-track, one for each of your ears, basically. We mix those signals down into a 2-track format that the consumer can listen to. Something like MP3, right? We love MP3s. No, a stereo file. All right, so I'm getting the signal that we are ready. So, who in here is actually playing in the band?